The morning mist hung low over the Central Highlands, clinging to the dense canopy like a funeral shroud. It was March 3rd, 1969. At Ben Het Special Forces Camp, Specialist 4. Frank Hembry sat in the cramped turret of his M48 Patton tank, his eyes scanning the darkness through the infrared searchlight. The jungle was silent, but the silence itself felt dangerous, pregnant with something unseen. He had been in Vietnam for 7 months. 7 months of mud, monsoons, and the constant hum of tension that never truly faded. But tonight felt different. Earlier that evening, a CIDG patrol had reported the unmistakable sound of engines echoing from the Cambodian border. Not the familiar roar of American vehicles, but something foreign, something mechanical and menacing, advancing through the jungle. Hembry loaded a heat round into the breech of the 90mm gun. Around him, 3 other M48 Pattons from Company B, 1st Battalion, 69th Armour, waited in their dug-in positions on the hill overlooking the camp. Below them, 12 Green Berets and 400 Montagnard tribesmen manned the perimeter of what was supposed to be just another remote outpost along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They had no idea they were about to participate in the only tank-versus-tank battle between American and North Vietnamese forces in the entire war. At 2100 hours, the night exploded. An anti-tank mine detonated roughly 800 meters to the southwest, and in the sudden flash of orange light, Hembry saw something that made his blood freeze. The unmistakable silhouette of a PT-76 light tank, its 76mm gun already traversing toward their position. Behind it, at least a dozen more armored vehicles materialized from the darkness like steel ghosts, their engines screaming as they charged toward the camp. The North Vietnamese 4th Battalion, 202nd Armored Regiment, had arrived. What happened next would become legend among American tankers in Vietnam, a furious, chaotic gun duel fought in near-total darkness, where men sighted their weapons on nothing but muzzle flashes and prayed their aim was true. The Vietnam War is remembered primarily as an infantry conflict, a guerrilla struggle fought in rice paddies and jungle trails, where the enemy was invisible and victory was measured in body counts rather than territory. The iconic images of the war feature helicopters, not tanks, Marines storming beaches, not armored columns. But this perception, while understandable, obscures a critical truth. Armored vehicles played a decisive role in Vietnam, one that has been largely forgotten by history. Over 600 M48 Patton tanks served in the conflict, supported by hundreds of M113 armored personnel carriers, M551 Sheridan light tanks, and the fearsome M67 Zippo flame tanks. These iron beasts carved paths through jungle so thick that infantry could barely move, provided mobile firepower that saved countless lives and fought in conditions they were never designed to face. The story of tanks in Vietnam is not the story of sweeping armored offensives across open terrain, as in World War II or the Arab-Israeli conflicts. It is a story of adaptation, of men and machines pushed beyond their limits, of a new kind of warfare that would reshape military doctrine for generations. It is a story that deserves to be told. The M48 Patton was the backbone of American armor in Vietnam. Weighing nearly 50 tons and armed with a 90mm main gun, it was a direct descendant of the great tank battles of World War II, designed to fight Soviet T-54s on the plains of Europe, not Viet Cong guerrillas in triple canopy jungle. When the first M48s arrived in South Vietnam with the 1st and 3rd Marine Tank Battalions in 1965, many military experts questioned whether tanks could operate effectively in such terrain. They were wrong. The Patton proved remarkably versatile. Its thick armor could withstand most small arms fire and even some anti-tank weapons. Its 90mm gun could fire a devastating array of ammunition, high-explosive rounds for bunkers, canister rounds filled with thousands of steel flechettes for enemy infantry, and heat rounds for the rare armored threat. Perhaps most importantly, the tank's sheer mass made it ideal for jungle busting, crashing through dense vegetation to create paths for following infantry. But Vietnam extracted a heavy price for every advantage. The M48's Continental engine ran hot in the tropical climate, and mechanical breakdowns were frequent. The tank's weight, which made it such an effective battering ram, also made it vulnerable to mines. Between 1965 and 1968, 120 M48s were written off as total losses, many of them destroyed by anti-tank mines buried beneath roads and trails. The crews who served in these tanks developed a fatalistic humor about their situation. They named their vehicles with dark irony: Death Dealer, Widowmaker, Apocalypse Now. They learned to check every stretch of road for freshly turned earth, to never assume that any route was safe twice. They came to understand that in Vietnam, the enemy was not just the man with the rifle, but the very ground beneath their tracks. At Ben Het, Specialist Hembry did not have time for such reflections. The PT-76 that had triggered the mine was burning now, its crew either dead or fleeing, but 7 or 8 more vehicles were still advancing, their guns flashing in the darkness. Captain John Stovall, commanding the tank platoon, was scrambling onto Sergeant Havermale's Patton when a high-explosive round struck the loader's hatch directly. The blast threw both men from the tank, spraying them with shrapnel. The driver and loader were killed instantly. But remarkably, the tank itself remained operational. The M48's thick armor had absorbed the impact without catastrophic damage to the vehicle. This was the difference between American and North Vietnamese armor. The PT-76 was an amphibious reconnaissance tank designed for scouting missions and river crossings. Its armor was thin, barely adequate to stop heavy machine gun fire. Against the M48's 90mm heat rounds, it was virtually defenseless. Within minutes, Hembry had found his target, a PT-76 illuminated by the burning wreckage of its companion. He squeezed the trigger. The Patton rocked with recoil, and across the battlefield, the enemy tank exploded. Another M48, commanded by Specialist 4 Eddie Davis, destroyed a second vehicle. The remaining North Vietnamese tanks, realizing they were outgunned, began to scatter. An AC-47 Spooky gunship arrived overhead, its miniguns raking the retreating column with thousands of rounds. By dawn, the battlefield was silent. 2 PT-76 tanks and 1 BTR-50 armored personnel carrier lay wrecked in front of the camp's perimeter. The North Vietnamese had retreated across the border, leaving behind bloody bandages and abandoned equipment. American losses: 2 men killed, 2 wounded, 1 M48 damaged but repairable. The Battle of Ben Het lasted only a few hours, but its significance extended far beyond the tactical. It demonstrated that American armor, properly employed, could dominate the battlefield even against enemy tanks. It proved that the M48 Patton was more than capable of handling any threat Vietnam could offer. And it sent a message to Hanoi that their nascent armored forces were not yet ready to challenge American steel. For the tank crews at Ben Het, however, the victory was bittersweet. They had won, but 2 of their brothers would never go home. In the grey light of morning, as they surveyed the wreckage of destroyed enemy vehicles, they understood something that few Americans back home would ever grasp. Tanks mattered in Vietnam, and the men who crewed them paid the same price as any infantry soldier. The jungle was quiet again, but it would not remain so for long. Across South Vietnam, from the Mekong Delta to the DMZ, American tanks were fighting battles that would never make the evening news. Small, brutal engagements that tested men and machines to their limits. And somewhere in the north, Hanoi's generals were studying the lessons of Ben Het, preparing for a new phase of the war where armor would play an increasingly central role. The iron beasts of the jungle had not yet revealed their full destructive potential. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you appreciate stories that reveal the forgotten truths of history, the battles that shaped the world but never made the headlines, then you belong here. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss another journey into the past. The first thing Corporal Miguel Santos noticed was the smell. Even before the M67 flame tank rolled into position, even before the order came to open fire, he could smell the mixture of jellied gasoline and compressed air that would soon turn the Vietnamese tree line into an inferno. It was a smell he had come to associate with victory and with nightmares. It was July 7th, 1967. The 1st Marine Division was conducting operations near Da Nang, and intelligence had reported a Viet Cong position concealed somewhere in the dense vegetation ahead. Artillery had already pounded the area, but the bunkers were too well constructed, too deeply dug into the earth. The enemy was still there, waiting. That was when they called for the Zippos. The M67 flamethrower tank was perhaps the most psychologically devastating weapon in the American arsenal. Built on the chassis of the M48 Patton, it replaced the standard 90mm gun with a flamethrower capable of projecting burning napalm up to 280 meters. In place of conventional ammunition, it carried 365 gallons of thickened fuel that, when ignited and expelled under pressure, created what soldiers called rods of flame, jets of burning gel that consumed everything in their path. The Geneva Conventions prohibited the use of incendiary weapons against civilians, but the Zippos were designed for a different purpose, destroying fortified positions that conventional weapons could not reach. Bunkers, tunnels, spider holes. The elaborate defensive networks that the Viet Cong constructed beneath the Vietnamese countryside were virtually impervious to bullets and resistant to explosives. But fire could reach them. Fire could follow the turns of a tunnel, consume the oxygen inside a bunker, and burn out defenders who had survived everything else. Santos was not a tank crewman. He was an infantry corporal assigned to escort duty, one of the Marines tasked with protecting the vulnerable Zippos as they moved into position. The flame tanks required a support convoy of 2.5-ton trucks carrying additional napalm and compressed air cylinders, making them high-value targets for enemy ambush. His job was to ensure the tanks reached their objective, but watching the Zippos in action was something that stayed with a man forever. The lead tank, designated Dragon, advanced toward the tree line, its fake 90mm barrel, actually the flamethrower nozzle, disguised to resemble a conventional gun, tracking left and right as the crew searched for targets. Then, without warning, it fired. The rod of flame shot from the tank in a perfectly straight line, striking a cluster of vegetation at the edge of the tree line. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, the napalm ignited. The explosion of fire was not like anything Santos had seen from conventional weapons. It was not a flash and done. Instead, the flames spread with an almost liquid quality, rolling across the ground, climbing into the trees, seeking out every crack and crevice where the enemy might be hiding. The heat was so intense that Santos could feel it on his face from 100 meters away. The sound was like a constant roar, punctuated by the smaller detonations of ammunition cooking off somewhere within the inferno. And then the screaming began. 2 Viet Cong fighters emerged from the flames, their bodies completely engulfed. They ran for perhaps 10 meters before collapsing. Santos did not fire. Neither did anyone else. There was no need. The fire would finish what it had started. The second Zippo fired into a different section of the tree line, then the first fired again. Within minutes, a swath of jungle nearly 200 meters wide was completely consumed by flames. Secondary explosions indicated that the enemy's ammunition stores had been hit. The Viet Cong position, so carefully constructed, so patiently defended, had been erased from existence in less than 5 minutes. After the flames died down, the infantry advanced to confirm the destruction. They found the remains of bunkers, their log roofs collapsed and charred. They found tunnels, their entrances now smoking pits. They found weapons, warped and melted by the heat, and they found bodies. How many exactly, Santos never knew, because the fire had reduced most of them to unrecognizable forms. The M67 Zippo was one of only 109 flame tanks ever produced for the US military, and only the Marine Corps employed them in actual combat. The Army had briefly experimented with the design, but ultimately declined to deploy it, leaving the Marines as the sole operators of this fearsome weapon. Throughout the Vietnam War, these tanks would become synonymous with some of the conflict's most intense and controversial operations. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, Zippos played a crucial role in the Battle of Hue. When the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong seized control of the ancient imperial city, American forces faced the daunting task of dislodging them from centuries-old buildings and fortifications. Conventional weapons risked destroying irreplaceable cultural heritage. High explosives could not penetrate the thick stone walls without bringing the entire structures down. The solution was fire. 2 M67s accompanied a column of M48 Pattons as they punched into the city on February 12, 1968. The flame tanks proved devastatingly effective in urban combat. Even more so than in the jungle, a single burst from the flamethrower could clear an entire building, the fire racing through windows and doorways to consume defenders before they could react. Enemy soldiers who had survived artillery barrages and withstood hours of rifle fire broke and ran when the Zippos approached. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. But the Zippos had limitations that prevented them from becoming the dominant weapon of the war. Their specialized fuel supply meant they could only fire for approximately 45 seconds before needing to be resupplied, a process that required the vulnerable support convoy to move up and expose the tanks to enemy fire. The napalm was highly flammable, making the M67s themselves potential death traps if hit by enemy rockets or mines. And the moral implications of their use increasingly troubled both the military and the American public. By 1974, the M67 was retired from service without a replacement. The United States military would never again field a dedicated flame tank. The weapon that had once struck such terror into enemy hearts had become, in the eyes of many, too terrible to use. For men like Corporal Santos, who had witnessed the Zippos in action, the memories never faded. Decades later, he would still sometimes wake in the night to the smell of burning, a phantom sensation that transported him back to that July day near Da Nang, when he learned what war truly looked like when it wore a face of fire. The Viet Cong learned to fear the distinctive rumble of the M67's engine, the sight of that odd-looking gun barrel that promised death in its most primal form. They gave it their own name in Vietnamese, one that roughly translated to "the dragon that breathes hell." It was a fitting title for a weapon that represented both the terrible ingenuity and the moral complexity of modern warfare. In the end, the Zippo disappeared, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. It was too effective, too horrifying, too difficult to justify in a war that was already losing the battle for American hearts and minds. The flames that consumed enemy bunkers also consumed something in the American conscience, a willingness to use certain weapons regardless of their effectiveness. But for those who faced the Zippo's wrath, such philosophical considerations meant nothing. For them, there was only the fire and the desperate hope that it would pass them by. The M551 Sheridan arrived in Vietnam wrapped in promise and expectation. It was the future of American armor, a light tank that could be parachuted into combat, swim across rivers, and destroy enemy tanks with guided missiles. It represented everything that military technology could achieve in the modern age. It was also, as its crews would soon discover, one of the most dangerous vehicles ever sent into combat. Sergeant First Class David Brennan was among the first American tankers to receive the Sheridan when it arrived at Long Bin in January 1969. He had spent the previous 2 years commanding an M48 Patton with the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, and his initial impression of the new tank was one of cautious optimism. It was certainly sleeker than the Patton, lower, faster, with clean lines that suggested modernity and capability. The 150mm gun launcher was massive, capable of firing both conventional rounds and the Shilela anti-tank missile. On paper, the Sheridan was everything the Army had promised. The problems began almost immediately. The first thing Brennan noticed was the armor, or rather the lack of it. The Sheridan's hull was constructed from aluminum alloy, chosen to reduce weight for air transport operations. This made the tank light enough to be dropped by parachute and capable of swimming across rivers, but it also meant that the protection offered to the crew was minimal. The aluminum could stop small arms fire, but anything heavier, a 12, a 7mm machine gun round, an RPG, even a large mine, would penetrate with ease. In Vietnam, where mines were everywhere and RPGs were the enemy's primary anti-armor weapon, this was a death sentence waiting to happen. The second problem was the ammunition. The Sheridan used combustible-cased cartridges for its 152mm gun, rounds where the metal casing was replaced by a material that burned away when the gun fired. This reduced the weight of ammunition and eliminated the need to eject spent casings, but it also created a catastrophic vulnerability. If the tank was penetrated by enemy fire, the combustible material could ignite, turning the entire ammunition supply into a massive firebomb. The Sheridan did not just catch fire when hit, it exploded. On February 15, 1969, less than 1 month after the Sheridan's arrival in Vietnam, Brennan witnessed the first such explosion. A tank from his squadron was crossing a stream near the DMZ when it detonated a pressure-triggered mine. The blast ruptured the aluminum hull, sending sparks into the crew compartment. The combustible ammunition caught fire instantly. The secondary explosion was heard miles away. The 48-metric-ton turret, the only steel component of the vehicle, was blown completely off the hull by the force of the detonation. All 4 crew members were killed. When recovery teams reached the site, they found that the aluminum hull had literally melted, leaving behind a twisted mass of metal that barely resembled a tank. The nightmare had begun. Over the following months, the pattern repeated itself with horrifying regularity. 3 Sheridans from the 4th Squadron, 12th Cavalry, detonated on mines during a river crossing, total losses with no survivors. 5 vehicles from the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment were destroyed in a single Viet Cong ambush during Operation Lam Son 719, the crews killed before they could even abandon their burning tanks. In engagement after engagement, the Sheridan proved itself incapable of surviving the type of combat it was being asked to face. The tank's advocates pointed to its advantages, and there were some. The 152mm gun was devastatingly effective against enemy bunkers and infantry concentrations. The Beehive round, loaded with thousands of flechettes, could cut down waves of charging soldiers with a single shot. The tank was fast and maneuverable, capable of going places the heavier M48 could not reach. And the crews who survived their tours spoke highly of the firepower they could bring to bear. But the statistics told a different story. By the end of the war, approximately 100 M551 Sheridans had been lost in Vietnam, a staggering casualty rate for a vehicle that was never deployed in large numbers. Many of these losses were total write-offs, with the tank's aluminum hull either melted by fire or too badly damaged to repair. The crew survival rate in catastrophic hits was essentially 0. If this story is touching something inside you, if you feel the weight of these men's sacrifice and the tragedy of a weapon that became a coffin, then leave a comment right now saying, "Their courage deserves to be remembered." Let me know you understand what these soldiers faced, and let's honor them together. The tragedy of the Sheridan was not simply one of failed technology. It was a tragedy of institutional momentum, of a military establishment so committed to a particular vision of the future that it could not acknowledge the reality of the present. The Army had invested over $1 billion in the Sheridan program. It had promised Congress that the new tank would revolutionize armored warfare. It had built 1,500 vehicles and trained thousands of crews. To admit that the tank was fundamentally unsuited for Vietnam would have been to admit that all of this had been wasted. So the Sheridans kept rolling into combat and the crews kept dying. General Creighton Abrams, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, had personally pushed for the Sheridan's deployment, believing that its firepower would compensate for its vulnerabilities. But even Abrams could not ignore the mounting evidence. By 1970, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment was quietly ordered to retain its M48 patterns rather than converting entirely to Sheridans. The writing was on the wall. For men like Sergeant Brennan, the experience of serving in the Sheridan left permanent scars. Not physical wounds, but the knowledge that he had been sent into combat in a vehicle that his own military knew was deficient. The aluminum hull, the combustible ammunition, the inadequate armor. These were not secrets. They were documented in reports, discussed in briefings, acknowledged by officers who nevertheless continued to send young men into battle in death traps. Brennan survived his tour, transferred to a staff position, and never served in a tank again. But he never forgot the faces of the men who had not been so lucky. The crews who had climbed into their Sheridans on hot Vietnamese mornings and never climbed out again. The M551 Sheridan would continue in service until 1996, eventually finding a home with the 82nd Airborne Division, where its airdrop capability was finally relevant. It would see action in Panama and Desert Storm, where its performance was somewhat better than in Vietnam. But for those who had witnessed its failures in Southeast Asia, the tank would always be remembered as a symbol of what happens when military ambition outpaces military reality. In the end, approximately 200 Sheridans served in Vietnam at the peak of the deployment. They fought bravely, their crews displaying courage that their equipment did not deserve. But the iron logic of combat had rendered its verdict. The Sheridan was not the future of American armor. It was a dead end, built of aluminum and good intentions, that consumed the lives of young men in service of a technological fantasy. The jungle claimed them all eventually. The tanks that burned, the crews that died, the dreams that went up in smoke along with the combustible ammunition. In the green hell of Vietnam, the M551 Sheridan became not a weapon of victory, but a monument to the costs of hubris. The Battle of Ap Bac should have been a victory. On January 2, 1963, South Vietnamese forces, equipped with American M113 armored personnel carriers, moved to engage a Viet Cong battalion near the village of Ap Bac in the Mekong Delta. They outnumbered the enemy nearly 10-1. They had armor, artillery, helicopters, and American advisors directing their movements. By every calculation, the battle should have been a decisive triumph for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Instead, it became a disaster that would reshape the way armored vehicles were used for the remainder of the war. The M113 was never designed for direct combat. It was a battle taxi, an aluminum box on tracks meant to transport infantry to the edge of the fighting, where they would dismount and engage the enemy on foot. The vehicle's armor was just thick enough to stop rifle rounds. Its only armament was a single .50 caliber machine gun mounted on top of the vehicle, operated by a crew member who stood exposed from the waist up. At Ap Bac, this design proved lethal for the Americans and South Vietnamese. The Viet Cong had studied their enemy's tactics. They knew that the M113s would approach in column, that the crews would be exposed, and that the vehicles themselves were vulnerable to concentrated fire. They waited until the South Vietnamese armored column was fully committed, then opened fire from concealed positions. 14 50-caliber gunners were killed in the first minutes of the battle. 14 men standing in their hatches, cut down by automatic weapons fire before they could even identify their attackers. The surviving M113s, now effectively disarmed, milled in confusion while the infantry they carried huddled inside, refusing to dismount into the maelstrom of fire. The battle ended in ignominious retreat. The Viet Cong escaped with minimal casualties. The Americans and South Vietnamese lost 5 helicopters, 3 M113s, and over 80 dead, including those 14 gunners who had died doing exactly what they had been trained to do. In the aftermath of Ap Bac, a young South Vietnamese officer named Lieutenant Colonel Le Van Hung made a decision that would transform the M113 from a liability into one of the most effective fighting vehicles of the war. Hung understood that the problem was not the M113 itself, but the doctrine that governed its use. The battle taxi concept assumed that armored personnel carriers would never face serious opposition, that they would deliver their passengers to a relatively safe dismount point and then withdraw. But Vietnam was not that kind of war. Here, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, capable of appearing suddenly and disappearing just as quickly. There was no safe dismount point. There was only the fire and the need to survive it. The solution was simple in concept but revolutionary in execution. Transform the M113 from a transport vehicle into a fighting platform. Working with the ARVN 80th Ordnance Unit, Hung's mechanics began fabricating gun shields for the 50-caliber machine guns, protective barriers cut from the hulls of scrapped vehicles that would allow the gunner to fire without exposing his entire upper body. They added 2 M60 machine guns to the rear of each vehicle, operated by crew members who now had their own protective shields. They welded additional armor plates to the floors to protect against mines. They mounted extra ammunition boxes and improved the storage for grenades and smoke canisters. The result was designated the Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle, the ACAV. It was no longer a taxi. It was a fighting machine. The Americans, initially skeptical of the South Vietnamese modifications, soon recognized their value. When the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment arrived in Vietnam in 1966, it brought with it standardized ACAV kits that incorporated the best features of the field modifications. The regiment also brought a new tactical doctrine. Instead of dismounting to fight, the cavalry would fight mounted, using the speed and firepower of the ACAVs to overwhelm enemy positions before they could organize effective resistance. The herringbone formation became standard anti-ambush procedure. When caught in an ambush, consecutive ACAVs would alternate turning left and right off the road, then advance at full speed while pouring fire into the ambush positions from multiple angles. This counterattack from the march broke countless Viet Cong attempts to dominate the road network and transformed what had been death traps into killing grounds for the enemy. Specialist 5 Robert Chen was a track commander with the 11th ACR during the 1968 Tet Offensive, and he would later describe the ACAV as the best fighting vehicle we had, not because of what it was designed to be, but because of what we made it. His ACAV, nicknamed Bad Medicine, carried 3 machine guns, a grenade launcher, 800 pounds of extra ammunition, and enough sandbags on the floor to give the crew a fighting chance against mines. Chen had personally supervised the modifications, trading cigarettes and favors with the support units to acquire materials that were never officially authorized. On the night of January 31st, 1968, when the North Vietnamese launched their coordinated assault across South Vietnam, Chen's platoon was guarding a stretch of highway near Bien Hoa. The attack came without warning. A full company of NVA regulars emerging from the tree line with AK-47s blazing. Chen gave the order to execute the herringbone maneuver. The 5 ACAVs of his platoon spread out, their drivers gunning the engines while the gunners opened fire. The sound was deafening. 3 machine guns per vehicle, 15 weapons total, pouring thousands of rounds into the enemy position in a matter of seconds. The NVA assault collapsed. Soldiers who had expected to overwhelm a convoy of soft-skinned trucks found themselves facing a wall of steel and fire. Those who tried to press forward were cut down. Those who tried to retreat were caught by the flanking ASAVs. By the time the shooting stopped, over 40 enemy bodies littered the roadside. Chen's platoon suffered 1 man wounded, a loader who had taken shrapnel in the shoulder when a rocket-propelled grenade detonated against his shield. The shield, fabricated from scrap metal in a forward repair shop, had saved his life. This was the legacy of APAC transformed. The 14 gunners who had died there had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had forced the military to reimagine what an armored personnel carrier could be. From their blood had grown a doctrine that would save countless lives and establish the ACAV as the most effective armored fighting vehicle of the Vietnam War. By the end of the conflict, thousands of M113s had been converted to ACAV configuration. They fought in every major operation, from the Tet Offensive to the Cambodian incursion to Operation Lam Son 719. They proved that soldiers in the field, when given the freedom to adapt their equipment to the reality of combat, could overcome the limitations of doctrine and design. The M113 remains in service today, over 60 years after its introduction. Its descendants and variants have fought in dozens of conflicts around the world. And somewhere in the institutional memory of the US military, the lessons of the ACAV endure, a reminder that the best weapons are not always those designed by engineers, but those forged in the crucible of combat by the men who must use them. Lieutenant Nguyen Xuan Mai had never expected to become a tank killer. Growing up in a small village near Saigon, he had dreamed of becoming a teacher, perhaps a scholar like his father. But the war had interrupted those dreams, as it interrupted everything in Vietnam. And now he found himself in the cramped turret of an M41 Walker Bulldog light tank, watching Soviet-built T-54s advance toward his position through the morning mist. It was February 19, 1971. Operation Lam Son 719, the South Vietnamese invasion of Laos, was collapsing. What had begun as an ambitious attempt to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival as North Vietnamese forces counterattacked with overwhelming strength. Landing Zone 31, where Mai's tank troop was positioned, was about to become the site of the first major armor battle of the operation. The M41 Walker Bulldog was not a tank designed for this fight. Weighing only 23 tons, armed with a 76mm gun, and protected by armor barely adequate to stop heavy machine gun fire, it was classified as a light tank, a reconnaissance vehicle meant for scouting missions, not head-to-head combat with main battle tanks. Against the T-54, with its 100mm gun and vastly superior armor, the Walker Bulldog should have been hopelessly outmatched. But Mai had advantages that did not appear in the technical specifications. He had trained extensively with American advisors. His crew was experienced and motivated, and most importantly, he understood that in tank warfare, the first accurate shot usually decided the engagement. The T-54s were advancing in column along a narrow jungle trail, their crews apparently confident that the ARVN defenders had already fled. They had not yet spotted Mai's tanks, which were dug into hull-down positions on a ridge overlooking the approach route. The lead North Vietnamese tank was perhaps 800 meters away when Mai gave the order to fire. The 76mm gun barked. The heat-round, high-explosive anti-tank struck the T-54 in the turret ring, penetrating the armor and detonating inside the crew compartment. The tank stopped dead, smoke pouring from its hatches. Before the second T-54 could react, Mai's loader had another round in the breech. Fire, another hit, Another kill. The ambush had caught the North Vietnamese completely by surprise. Their superior firepower meant nothing if they could not bring it to bear. As T-54s attempted to deploy off the narrow trail, they bogged down in the soft ground or presented their vulnerable flanks to the waiting bulldogs. By the time the engagement ended, Mai's troop had destroyed 6 T-54s and 16 PT-76 light tanks without losing a single vehicle. It was, in many ways, the high point of ARVN armor in the Vietnam War. The Walker Bulldogs had proven that superior training and tactics could overcome material disadvantages. Mai himself was credited with destroying 3 enemy tanks, a feat that earned him promotion and recognition as one of the ARVN's premier tank commanders. But the victory at LZT-1 could not change the overall trajectory of Lam Son 7119. The operation was already failing, undermined by poor planning, confused command structures, and the sheer weight of North Vietnamese opposition. Within weeks, the ARVN forces that had entered Laos so confidently were streaming back across the border in disarray, leaving behind hundreds of vehicles, including many of the Walker Bulldogs that had fought so well. For the North Vietnamese, Lam Son 719 was a learning experience. Their tank crews had performed poorly in the initial engagements, victims of inadequate training and poor coordination with infantry. But they studied their failures with the same intensity that they had studied the Americans' tactics for years. They understood that armor would be essential to the final victory, and they were determined to master it. The fruits of that study became apparent in the Easter Offensive of 1972. When North Vietnamese forces surged across the DMZ on March 30th, they brought with them over 600 tanks, T-54s, Type 59s, the Chinese variant of the T-54, and the lighter PT-76s. This was not a guerrilla army anymore. This was a conventional military force capable of fighting the kind of war that American doctrine had always anticipated. The ARVN 20th Tank Regiment, equipped with M48 Pattons inherited from departing American units, was stationed near Dong Ha when the attack came. On April 2nd, Easter Sunday, the regiment received reports of a massive enemy tank column approaching from the north. This time, it would be the M48's turn to prove themselves. Captain Tran Van Hoa commanded the regiment's 1st Squadron. Unlike Mai's Bulldogs, the Pattons were true main battle tanks, capable of engaging the T-54 on equal terms. But Hoa faced challenges that transcended technology. His regiment was newly formed, his crews had received only limited training on the American equipment, and the technical manuals had been translated so poorly that terms like ballistic computer became adding machine in Vietnamese. Nevertheless, when the North Vietnamese tanks appeared on the horizon, Hoa ordered his squadron into battle. The engagement at Dong Ha would become one of the largest tank battles of the entire war. The M48 Pattons opened fire at nearly 3,000 meters, far beyond the effective range of the T-54's guns. The superior optics and training of the ARVN tankers allowed them to score hits, while the North Vietnamese rounds fell short. By the end of that first day, the 20th Tank Regiment claimed 16 T-54s destroyed without losing a single Patton. It was a stunning validation of American equipment and ARVN courage. But the Easter Offensive was far from over. The North Vietnamese had learned from their mistakes. They adapted their tactics, coordinating armor with infantry and artillery in ways they had never done before. They introduced new weapons, the AT-3 Saga wire-guided missile, that could destroy tanks from concealed positions, and they kept coming, wave after wave, accepting losses that would have broken any Western army. By May 2nd, 1972, the 20th Tank Regiment had lost all of its tanks to enemy fire. The regiment that had fought so brilliantly at Dong Ha had been ground down to nothing by the relentless pressure of the offensive. Captain Hoa survived, but many of his men did not. The Easter Offensive ultimately failed to achieve its objectives, stopped by a combination of ARVN resistance and massive American air power, but it demonstrated that the nature of the war had fundamentally changed. The days of guerrilla ambushes and jungle fighting were giving way to conventional armored warfare, the kind of war that would ultimately decide Vietnam's fate. 3 years later, when North Vietnamese tanks finally crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, it was a T-54 bearing the number 843 that led the way. The image became the defining symbol of the war's end, proof that armor, properly employed and relentlessly applied, could achieve what decades of guerrilla warfare had not. For men like Lieutenant Mai and Captain Hoa, who had fought so hard in their American-made tanks, the fall of Saigon was a bitter conclusion to years of sacrifice. Many fled the country, joining the exodus of refugees who would scatter across the globe. Others were not so fortunate, spending years in re-education camps as punishment for their service. But the lessons they had learned and taught about armored warfare in difficult terrain would influence military doctrine for generations. The tanks of Vietnam, American and Soviet alike, had written a new chapter in the history of mechanized combat. The last American tank left Vietnam in the spring of 1972, loaded onto a transport ship at Cam Ranh Bay as part of the final withdrawal of U.S. ground forces. Its crew, young men who had spent their tour patrolling roads, supporting infantry operations, and occasionally engaging an enemy that seemed to materialize from the earth itself, watched the coastline recede with mixed emotions. Relief, certainly, but also something harder to name, a sense of incompleteness, of a job left unfinished. They were leaving behind more than just a war. They were leaving behind the graves of brothers who had died in burning tanks, the wrecks of vehicles that still littered the countryside, and a South Vietnamese ally that would soon face the final onslaught alone. The story of tanks in Vietnam defies simple conclusions. It was not a story of triumph like the armored offensives of World War II. It was not a story of failure despite the ultimate fall of South Vietnam. It was something more complex. A story of adaptation, of courage, of machines and men pushed beyond their limits in pursuit of objectives that shifted like sand. The M48 Patton proved that main battle tanks could operate effectively in jungle terrain, confounding the experts who had declared Vietnam unsuitable for armor. Over 600 Pattons served in the conflict, and despite the challenges of climate, terrain, and enemy tactics, they provided firepower and protection that saved countless infantry lives. The tank that had been designed to fight Soviet armor on the plains of Europe found a new purpose in the rice paddies and highlands of Southeast Asia. The M67 Zippo demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness and the moral complexity of incendiary weapons. Its flames cleared bunkers that no other weapon could reach, but the images of burning villages and fleeing civilians contributed to the growing opposition to the war. The Zippo was retired not because it failed, but because success itself had become too costly to bear. The M551 Sheridan revealed the dangers of deploying unproven technology in combat. Its innovative design promised capabilities that existing tanks could not match, but its aluminum armor and combustible ammunition made it a death trap for the crews who served in it. The approximately 100 Sheridans lost in Vietnam stand as a monument to the gap between military ambition and battlefield reality. The M113 ACAV showed what soldiers could achieve when given the freedom to adapt their equipment. Born from the blood of APAC, the ACAV transformation turned a vulnerable transport vehicle into one of the war's most effective fighting platforms. It was a lesson in innovation, proof that the best ideas often come not from engineers in laboratories, but from men under fire. And the tank battles of the Easter Offensive, the clashes between M48s and T-54s, between Walker Bulldogs and PT-76, demonstrated that Vietnam had evolved from a guerrilla conflict into a conventional war. The armor that had seemed so out of place in 1965 had become essential by 1972. What then is the legacy of tanks in Vietnam? Perhaps it is simply this: that war refuses to conform to expectations. The military experts who declared that armor had no place in jungle warfare were wrong. The generals who believed that superior technology would guarantee victory were also wrong. The truth lay somewhere in between, in the mud and blood of actual combat, where men and machines were tested against an enemy who refused to fight according to the rules. The tankers who served in Vietnam, American, South Vietnamese, and North Vietnamese alike, understood this truth in ways that historians and strategists never could. They knew the sound of a mine detonating beneath their tracks, the smell of burning fuel and flesh, the weight of responsibility for the lives of their crews. They knew that bravery alone was not enough, that technology alone was not enough, that nothing was ever enough except the determination to keep fighting until the fighting was done. Most of them are old men now, if they are still alive at all. The tanks they crewed have been scrapped or sit in museums, their armor rusted, their guns silent. The jungle has reclaimed the battlefields where they fought, erasing the scars of combat beneath new growth. But the lessons remain. In military academies around the world, officers still study the armored operations of Vietnam, not as examples of triumph or failure, but as case studies in adaptation, in the eternal struggle between doctrine and reality. The ACAV concept influenced the development of infantry fighting vehicles. The failures of the Sheridan informed the design of later light tanks. The tactics developed in the Central Highlands and the Mekong Delta continue to shape how modern armies think about armored warfare in complex terrain. And somewhere, in the memories of aging veterans and the pages of unit histories, the iron beasts of Vietnam live on. The Pattons and Sheridans, the Zippos and ACAVs, the Bulldogs and T-54s. They were more than machines. They were extensions of the men who crewed them, instruments of both destruction and salvation, symbols of a war that changed everyone it touched. The mist still rises over the Central Highlands in the early morning, just as it did on that night at Ben Het, when American and North Vietnamese tanks clashed for the first and only time. The jungle is quiet now, but if you listen carefully, you might still hear echoes of what happened there, the roar of engines, the crack of guns, the shouts of men fighting for their lives in the darkness. History remembers the victors, but it should also remember those who fought, regardless of which side they served, regardless of whether their cause was just or their tactics sound. The tankers of Vietnam earned that remembrance through their courage, their sacrifice, and their willingness to climb into steel coffins and drive toward the sound of the guns. They were the iron beasts of the jungle, and their story deserves to be told. If you watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. It's because you understand that history is not just dates and battles. It's the lives of men who faced impossible odds and fought anyway. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. If this video moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. The men who crewed these tanks, American, South Vietnamese, and yes, even North Vietnamese, deserve to have their courage remembered. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. We're building something here, a community of people who believe that history matters, that the forgotten stories deserve to be told, and that understanding the past is the only way to navigate the future. Until next time, remember, the Iron Beasts may be silent now, but their legacy lives on in everyone who takes the time to listen.